Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy our conversations, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. Jews have experienced a lot over the past several millennia. We've struggled in the face of tragedy and adversity, and rejoiced in celebration. And for most of our history, we've been denied a national homeland. Yet, wherever we found ourselves, we built houses of worship, the Middle East, Europe, India, North and South America, and beyond. Synagogues are central to Jewish communities and the 4,000-year-old religion that has helped change the shape of world history. I'm fortunate enough to now be joined by prominent scholar and contributor to the new compendium, Synagogues, Marvels of Judaism, published by Rizzoli, Dr. Samuel Gruber. Dr. Gruber is here to talk about the architectural and historical evolution of several iconic synagogues across the Americas. His chapter, Synagogues in the New World, and the book as a whole, explore the intersection of art, architecture, and the practice of Judaism. Samuel Gruber is an accomplished researcher, author, curator, and consultant, and is founder and managing director of Gruber Heritage Global, GHG, a cultural resources consulting firm. He's a recognized expert in many aspects of art and architectural history and the historic preservation of cultural heritage sites. He's on the faculty at Syracuse and Cornell universities. Dr. Gruber previously joined our conversation series to discuss one of the oldest and least known Jewish communities in the diaspora, Greece's Romanio Jews. Sam, thank you for being here today. Great to have you back with us.
Good to see you, Dan, and good to participate and to celebrate this publication of a really beautiful new book that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy spending a lot of time browsing through.
Well, as one of the creators of Marvels of Judaism, I'd love to hear your insider's view of the book, particularly its concept and its evolution. It's a work of art in itself, even the front cover. Why is this topic a special one, and how is this subject and the diversity of its history, architectural forms, and symbolic vocabulary consolidated all into one volume?
All right, well, that's a lot of questions, so let's see if I can begin at the beginning. So I'm a contributor, really not a creator of this volume. A lot of people have been involved in the production. It is part of a series on religious architecture that Rizzoli has been publishing. A previous beautiful book on mosques came out about 2 or 3 years ago, and the project is conceived of by Leila Ulahani, who is a designer based in Paris and from Azerbaijan. And her vision and the vision of Rizzoli was to make these buildings of the world's religious cultures better known throughout the world, but also to emphasize a kind of world view of these structures rather than just a Eurocentric or an American-centric vision. And so people have been working in different countries to pull this material together. And I've been part of a team of some excellent scholars who were asked to help choose the buildings to be represented and to describe them, put them into some kind of context. But also an enormous team of photographers has been engaged. Some older photographs, but a lot of new photography has been included. And the photographic work in the book is really, really stunning. And a number of editors have been working. So really, it's a team effort, and I think it should be viewed that way.
There's so much that has gone into this book. You know, everybody has a synagogue. Everybody has seen synagogues. They've either seen them from the outside, they've been in many, they've traveled to family events, they've been in synagogues. People who've traveled around the world, I know many, often ask, where is the synagogue in country A or country B? Because of the variety of architecture and how these are all different around the world. So tell us about what readers might expect, material that might seem familiar, and what readers might not expect. For example, examples of synagogues from around the world that are little known treasures. A few brief examples of some unexpected gems that people might not have known about or thought about.
Right. So you said it. There are thousands of synagogues, around the world, and there have been even more in the past that have been lost, been destroyed, or Jews have moved on. So this is only, a selection and of a small number, but of buildings that are really historically and architecturally significant and significant to existing communities today. But everyone will find surprises, but they may be disappointed. They're never going to may not find their own synagogue. If people come to a book like this, they're going to be disappointed. I got involved in the project because about 20 years ago, I did a book on American synagogues for Rizzoli. And I remember when I would go around and lecture, I'd say, well, I could write another book just of the synagogues people have said in the audience. Why isn't my synagogue in your book? And you just told me about a synagogue yourself in which you grew up in, which sounds very interesting, which I have never seen and is, to my knowledge, not in any book. So maybe in some future it will appear. For me, the unexpected part in the book, we're seeing the sections about synagogues in the Middle East, in Iran, in the Caucasus, countries that I've never traveled to. And until recently, the synagogues were virtually unknown and inaccessible except to the local Jews in those places. So that's an extraordinary contribution to this book. I do know some of the synagogues from North Africa because I've worked in Morocco, but some of those are in this book, like the Ibn Danan synagogue in Fez or the Nahon synagogue in Tangier, both of which have been restored in recent years. But for someone who's living in the Caucasus, because there will also be a Russian version of this book, they'll look and see this book and look at American synagogues, and those will be new to them. So we're getting this global view, and I love seeing the connections between all of these places, because as you say, all synagogues are different and they derive a lot from the local environment in which they're created, both the time and the place. But there are also constants in all synagogues that make it a synagogue, certain things that are required. Obviously, the Aron HaKodesh, that is the Ark, and the Bima or Teva, the reader's platform from where the Torah is read, different types of seating, but there has to be seating, lighting, but there has to be lighting, windows, but there have to be windows. So there are going to be variations, but one can also see a continuity, a cultural continuity through time and across space, which I think is quite exhilarating. And this book shows the incredible diversity of Judaism, but also shows a general coherence as well. And I think people will enjoy it. You see that through the pictures, and then you get it obviously reinforced through the text.
I want to ask you about the photos. How do the book's opulent photos and concise text complement each other in ways that might be unique to the subject? That is, the history and the architecture of synagogues. The way I interpreted it, the photos provide views and details that will amaze even those who know a lot about or may even be congregants of synagogues and temples. So let's talk about those photos.
Well, architectural photography is an art in itself, and of course, one has to be pretty good at it. If you look at your own snapshots and compare them to the books and the pictures in this book, you'll probably most people would see a difference. When I did my first book on synagogues back in 1999, it was also called Synagogues. It was so hard to find photos. There were so few good photos of synagogues from around the world, and most places in the world, either we didn't even know the synagogues in those places, or if we did, they hadn't been adequately recorded. The last 30 years has made a big difference, and we have access to many more places. We have new technologies. Obviously, digital photography has made a big difference. Drone photography has made a difference. But we also just have interested and qualified people in places, in situ, who can actually contribute pictures from Iran or from Baku or Uzbekistan and from Moscow, from any country in the world. And that has been really has served this book very well. But you do have a number of indefatigable photographers who for many, many years have been going out and photographing synagogues. Louis Davidson, who has a great website, he's passed away, but this website, synagogues360.org, has over 500 synagogue interiors on view. And it's a great place to go. Once you've had your appetite whetted by this book, you'll find other resources in publications, but these days, especially online. My friend Paul Rocheleau, who I worked with 30 years ago, has compiled a lot of wonderful photographs over the years, and both Louis and Paul and many others have contributed to this book. But there's a new generation of photographers around the world, and they've been recruited. So we see a lot of great stuff.
Let's just take a brief detour for a second, because we have so many, since the fall of communism, let's say in 1989 in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and then fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, there has been so many routes, trips, and opportunities for private travel. There are local attempts to restore synagogues. I've been to Lithuania. I saw one of the synagogues in my mother's shtetl, which had been turned into a community center. It was just a plain classic wooden Lithuanian Polish style synagogue. How urgent is it for people like the photographers who have done the work for this book, and people like yourself who write about the history of synagogues? How important is it with the clock ticking to track down and inventory and photograph those remaining synagogues, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world that are not being used or have been repurposed? How do we get our arms around all of those, some of the magnificent buildings that are no longer in use?
Yeah, it's always a challenge, and we don't have to look all the way to Central and Eastern Europe to find endangered buildings. We lose more synagogues here in the United States, and at a faster rate probably than any other place in the world now. We have scores, maybe even hundreds of mid-century modern synagogues that are closing, that are being repurposed, that are being sold and even demolished. Not because of oppression, not because of the Holocaust or of communism or an inquisition or anything like that has caused the abandonment and destruction of Jewish cultural sites in the past, but only because demographic change. Jewish communities have become smaller, they've rearranged, they've split off, they've moved, and buildings are repurposed. We can't save all those buildings as synagogues. I do believe we should try to photograph them, and I encourage congregations to take this initiative themselves, photograph them while they're using them rather than wait till it's too late and we photograph an empty shell. In Europe, of course, we've encountered ruins. I started recording Jewish sites in the late 1980s, and we were dealing mostly with ruins. And some of them are still ruins, but as you say, many have been restored. Some have been restored, like the Temple Synagogue in Krakow, as a gem for the Jewish community, and still serves for Jewish use. But others have been restored as museums, as cultural centers. And you mentioned Lithuania. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, 4 former wooden synagogues. These are not wooden synagogues like Gvurdzits or Volpa, the great wooden synagogues of Eastern Europe. These are wooden synagogues built as late as the 1930s, in little buildings, but made of wood. But these were abandoned after the murder of the Jewish communities in the Holocaust. But these 4 have all been now restored as museums and cultural centers in recent years. So it's important to record them. It's important to save them when we can. But most important is when we can continue their Jewish identity and use. That's what we strive for. This book, the Rizzoli book we're talking about, mostly focuses on buildings that are still in Jewish use and which still function for Jewish worship. We know, a synagogue, and by the way, you mentioned the millennia of history. The synagogue, it's a Greek term. I mean, synagogues have been built for 2,000 years at least. But it's a house of assembly, a Beit Knesset. It's a house of study, a Beit Midrash, and it's a house of prayer, a Bet Tefillah. And most of the buildings, with a few exceptions, like the Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York, which is in this book, beautiful book, and the cover photo of the book is from the post synagogue, wonderful new Kiki Smith window in that restored building. But that building is now a museum. But most of the buildings in this book are still functioning for their original purpose, for Jewish study, Jewish assembly, and Jewish prayer.
Well, before we discuss the specific houses of worship in the Americas that you cover in your part of the book called Synagogues in the New World, can you briefly discuss how and why there's such a diversity of styles and aesthetics throughout the New World? And how did the first synagogue in the New World actually come to be?
Yeah, so not just in the New World. There are no rules in. Obviously, when the Bible was written, when the Hebrew Bible was written in all of its later editions, there were no synagogues. So it talks about the temple. It doesn't talk about the synagogue. The synagogue is really a creation of the the rabbinic period. And there may have been prayer halls in the diaspora in Egypt and in Greece before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, but really synagogues pick up after the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and then spread wherever Jews go, from Europe, in the Middle East, and of course to the New World. And from the get-go, they always were buildings built usually by local people using local styles, following local tastes. So they had liturgical requirements, but they didn't have aesthetic requirements. And a lot of it depends on the authority of the place in which Jews are living and building, whether the demands are coming from the top down, that is a king or a court is saying you must build this way. It can't be too big. It can't be too small. It can be on the street. It can't be on the street. To a place like America, there is no real central authority telling people what to do. And then the impetus is congregational. It comes from the desire, from the ability, from the resources of the community that is actually gathering together in a holy community, a kahil kadosha, to create their synagogue. And the first synagogues in America, both in Brazil, which is the earliest synagogue, very briefly in Recife, but then in the Caribbean, in places like Suriname and Curacao, and then up the Atlantic coast in America, beginning in the mid 1600s, New York and Newport and Charleston and Richmond, those places. These were Jews who came, very small, tiny communities. There were only about 1,500 Jews in America, I think, at the time of the Revolution. But they came from England and from Holland, and they were part of this Atlantic world of maritime trade that the descendants of Spanish and then Portuguese Jews established after they resettled in the Protestant countries of Holland and England, and then joined the economic expansion of the Dutch and English trading companies and came to the New World. So the first styles of synagogues actually derive from Holland, the great Dutch, the Synagogue synagogue, which is in this book, and Bevis Mark Synagogue in London, which is in this book. And then we see in Newport at the Touro Synagogue, which is the oldest standing synagogue in America, and in the synagogues in Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, these first synagogues, they all derive from that style, and they're actually getting their money and their rabbis and their, all of their support from those congregations too.
Let's talk about the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, created I think in 1763. What is the historical significance of that synagogue, its architectural elements and its symbolism? I've spoken there actually on the anniversary of the famous George Washington letter, and it's a magnificent interior. It's a small interior, but it's magnificent. Tell us a bit more about the Touro Synagogue.
Yeah, it's historically, obviously, incredibly important. It's aesthetically, important. It's also spiritually, I think, quite a rewarding place to go because it is small and intimate, but it represents sort of grand ideas. And it is not the first synagogue built in America. That was probably Shereth Israel, that was allowed to build a building maybe around 1730 in New York, but that early building doesn't survive. It's the first surviving building in mainland America in what would become the United States. And it's a long story. The reason it survived is quite remarkable. The fact that it was abandoned for a long time. There was no Jewish community in Newport for many decades, but the founders of the synagogue left an endowment, and it was essentially connected to Shereth Israel in New York, and with the commandment that the building be saved, that the Jewish presence be remembered. So it's really the first historic preservation effort for a Jewish site in the New World, I think, or in the United States anyway. And then obviously it's taken on greater meaning and value the longer Jews have been in this country. And as they've looked back to their origin and tried to interweave their origin story with the story of the growth of America and American democracy, they found that the Touro Synagogue is that very important link. And it was declared a national landmark, I think, in the mid 20th century. It's been a touchstone for connecting Jews to colonial history, to the Continental Congress, to George Washington, to a lot of dignitaries who visited there. So it's really the foundation on which much of our synagogue history rests. Architecturally, it's a very elegant kind of Georgian building, meaning the time of George the First, Second, Third, because this was a colonial outpost. But it does have echoes of those synagogues I mentioned in Holland and particularly in London. The space for women was up in the gallery, as was the norm in all of these Sephardi synagogues. But unlike Amsterdam, where the women were behind a screen and they could hardly see anything and you could hardly see them, the women in the Touro Synagogue had a much better view, and the balustrades are much lower, and the space between the balusters is much wider. So there's a much greater communication between men and women already in the 18th century. More so than in many Orthodox synagogues that you'll visit in the country today, because we've had sort of a return to a kind of a rigorous separation of gender, of sexes in some parts of the Jewish community. It's interesting because when you look at it, there's nothing ostensibly Jewish about it. It could be a library, it could be a meeting hall, and in fact, the architect, a guy named Peter Harrison, who was one of the leading architects in colonial America, did design the Redwood Library that's still in Newport, and he designed a mercantile hall and other sorts of things. But when you go in, it is Jewish. And that's the secret of synagogues all around the world in most periods, except maybe for about 100 years in the 19th century and into the 20th century when Judaism became very public. For most of Jewish history, synagogues have been fairly retiring, modest, sometimes required that by outside authorities, sometimes for self-protection of it by a Jewish community. But when you go inside, that's when you really enter the Jewish world. And that's where all the Jewish identity is. And of course, if you go to Torah, you've got the bima in the middle, you have the 10 Commandments over the ark. You know that you're in a vital Jewish space, in a very beautiful but very intentional Jewish space.
We're moving to a more modern synagogue. Let's take a closer look at the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles, built in 1929 to house congregation B'nai B'rith of Los Angeles, aptly named for this interview, I might add. As you write, even, quote, alongside the major movie theaters of LA on Wilshire Boulevard, the temple boldly holds its own. And looking at the synagogue sanctuary, it's got everything, including the color of the marble and other materials with which it is embellished. An Art Deco masterpiece, really. Who designed the building and what inspired its dramatic structure? And what about its congregants? Who were they when it opened?
Well, one of my favorite synagogues, at least for the theater of it. And I mean, we mentioned Hollywood. It is an extravagant building to go into, and quite an experience. I visited on several occasions, but most recently, since the very thorough and outstanding restoration and renovation of the interior, which makes everything shine, and you see the space, and you see all of the painting, which is really one of the high points. The painting by the artist Hugo Balin, as it was meant to be seen when it was painted almost 100 years ago. Wilshire Boulevard Temple was known as, and the rabbi Edgar Magnin was known as the rabbi to the stars, and the Wilshire Boulevard Temple was very much the temple, the Reform temple for Jews of the silent era, the Hollywood era, of the great, Warner Brothers and some of the other Jewish-owned studios. And it was the Warner Brothers who actually were members and friends of Magnin, and who put a lot of money into the building, and they sponsored the painting program. The architects, it was a team of architects. One of them, Edelman, is actually, I think it was the son of the previous rabbi of the congregation. I may be misremembering, although as a side, it's interesting, a descendant of that same family is a terrific mural conservator today, painting conservator today. And I've had the real pleasure of working with her on a project in Burlington, Vermont, where we've been restoring a 1910 mural from an Orthodox congregation, not from Reform like Wilshire Boulevard. It's an eclectic building. It's a big domed, it's a rotunda. It stands up on Wilshire Boulevard, has a big portico in front. Essentially, it's Romanesque, meaning medieval, early medieval in inspiration, but it draws on many other movements, as most American architecture did from the mid 19th century until through the 1920s, and really until the advent of modernism. So it has the opulence of a big 1920s movie theater, but it also has, for Jewish identity, really an abundance of inscriptions. The Shema is, the unifying prayer of Judaism is written around the oculus, the center point in the dome, and then unreeling around the whole perimeter of the sanctuary is an enormous continuous mural that depicts the history of the Jewish people from their beginnings up until modern times and their arrival in America, painted by a well-known at the time Jewish artist named Hugo Balin, who came from a Sephardi background. And Balin was actually an award-winning painter in the early 20th century, but then he went out to Hollywood and he became a art director in silent films, and eventually a director of many silent films. And that's what he was doing when he was recruited to paint this mural. And subsequently, he went on to paint many other murals, or about the same time. So the Griffin Observatory mural, which you may be familiar with, it was featured in the movie La La Land not too long ago. That's been beautifully restored. That's also a well-known Hugo Balin work. So the combination of a Jewish architect, Jewish artist, Jewish film studio heads, and this sort of progressive, liberal, very worldly rabbi, all created this confection. And I just want to say, talking about history, when Rabbi Magnin unveiled Hugo Balin's mural, this unspooling of Jewish history with figural and narrative scenes, there was a lot of outcry, because there's a traditional notion that Jews should not include representations of the human figure, especially in a synagogue, because of an interpretation of the second commandment, which sort of ebbs and flows at different times. But in recent times it's been fairly strong that graven images mean no figures, whereas other people say no figures if they're going to be idols and you're going to worship them, but as illustrations it's fine. So Magnin said, listen, this is the 20th century. This is an age of pictures, of motion pictures. This is how we tell the stories. This is the language that people understand. And this is not idolatry. This is essentially both education and celebration. Then he was vindicated. He was vindicated just a few years later when they discovered the synagogue in Touro the 3rd century synagogue, which is on the banks of the Euphrates River in present-day Syria. And lo and behold, there the whole synagogue was covered with these paintings of scenes from the Bible, of Moses and the Exodus and the story of Mordecai and Esther from Purim and all of these other narratives. Magnin could say, look, I told you so. What we're doing is as traditional as you can get, because Touro Europos is, if not it is one of the very oldest synagogues that has survived in the world. So that sort of connects the 20th century to the ancient world and the origins of the institution.
Sam, before we close it, 2 more synagogues, really, I'd like to talk about that you've covered. The next location is one that I've experienced firsthand, Elkins Park, Pennsylvania's Beth Shalom Synagogue and congregation. My sister and brother-in-law were members there. I know the synagogue. This was one of the final works conceived and developed by Frank Lloyd Wright, who I know developed a very close relationship with the synagogue's Rabbi Mortimer Cohen. Wright passed away shortly before the completion of the synagogue in 1959. What was the concept behind and the inspiration for Beth Shalom? And did it grow out of Wright's other late work?
Well, definitely, on the one hand, we can say Beth Shalom grows out of Wright's work. It is a work of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture as much or more than it is a work of traditional synagogue architecture. It is radically different than most synagogues that had come before it, but not entirely, because this was done in the 50s. It was dedicated in the late 50s. Already from the post-war period, from the late 40s on, other modern architects, Jewish architects, Eric Mendelsohn, who was a refugee from Europe, who was very famous as a modernist. He did the Einstein Tower in Potsdam and many other important buildings. And he got out of Germany and then went to Palestine and to England before he arrived in America and designed some very important synagogues in St. Louis and the Park Synagogue in Cleveland. He was already experimenting with these more expressive forms and getting rid of all of the historicism, the Gothic and the Romanesque and the Byzantine styles that American Jews had used to create their sanctuaries before. So Wright was, in a sense, already coming in, and Mortimer Cohen, the rabbi, was coming into a tradition that was already changing. Percival Goodman is another architect, and we have some of his work in the book. Goodman was prolific, and he was kind of the homegrown version of Mendelssohn, and went on to create about 50 synagogues. But Wright kind of fused a kind of Jewish vision, also with his Unitarian upbringing, and Mortimer Cohen's vision, and created something entirely new. It does draw on some of his earlier sketches and designs, but he's using a new kind of technology, a giant steel tripod, which kind of sits on a hexagonal base that people can see as sort of the essence of a Magen David, the Star of David. But then he creates this enormous tent, which he calls a tent of light, because it's of a double skin of glass and plastic. He's not averse to using new materials. People think Wright was a modernist was a traditionalist where he believed in the integrity of materials, and that's true. But he believed in new materials, and they had their own integrity as well. So he uses glass and plastic and steel. and he creates this mountain of of light. So light filters in different, as you know, if you've been there, anytime you visit, the light's going to be different because of the sky, the way it's transferred through these two levels of skin. But also at night, if you have the pleasure to be outside of the building when there's a nighttime service and it's all lit up, the thing glows like a mountain on fire. It is a tight, unified plan, but it is very unusual the way the sort of raking directions, and everything is angled, and there are rays that seem to come out like there's some central force at the core that is almost in a Kabbalistic way. And I don't think Wright knew too much about the Kabbalah, but he was interested in this kind of a idea of the force of nature, and he tried to bring that into a lot of his designs. But Mortimer Cohen certainly knew Kabbalah, and he did give Kabbalistic interpretations to some of Wright's forms, and he also gave Kabbalistic meaning to the colors of the big triangular stained glass window that hangs down over the congregation. And there's a photo of that in the new book as well. I mean, so much has been written about the Wright Synagogue. It's hard to know where to begin, and everyone approaches it in their own way and has a different reaction. But it is unusual. I mean, most synagogues are not like that Wright Synagogue. But the tent motif and the mountain motif do become rather common in American modernism. And some people associate it to the idea of a diaspora community. I wrote an article once called The Continuing Exodus, and just the idea that Jews are always moving from one building to another. They move from the city center out further to the suburbs, the exurbs. So it's a continuing exodus. And Beth Shalom made this exodus too from downtown Philadelphia. But so the tent, whether it's the tabernacle or the tents of Jacob, is a kind of appropriate motif. I think Jewish architects in many ways have preferred the tent. Modern architects have preferred the tent over the dome. But the dome of heaven, this sense of impermanence of the tent is very attractive to the Jewish experience and mentality, and maybe our expectations as well.
Finally, let's talk about the rose window at the Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York City. What can you tell us about the synagogue's relationship to its location on the Lower East Side, and its historical significance, and interestingly, its more recent revival? And who created this memorable stained glass rose window?
All right, well, I'm going to quibble a little bit, because in a sense, the window, which is put in, it's designed by the contemporary artist Kiki Smith, and it's absolutely stunning. It's really not a synagogue window, because it was installed after the building was no longer used as a synagogue, and it's now the Eldridge Street Museum, or the museum at Eldridge Street. It was transformed through a 25-year preservation project, where everything was immaculately restored back to its original 1880s appearance. But this window was left unresolved, because the original rose window of the synagogue, and this is the window over the ark. There's also a rose window in the facade as well. But the original rose window was blown out in a storm in the 1930s and had been filled in just with very plain glass block. So there was a lot of debate after the restoration of the building was complete, what to do, to leave it in the 1930s view, to try to recreate an 1880s stained glass window, which nobody had a photograph of, nobody had a representation of, or to come up with a new work of art that would allow this new institution, the museum, not only to look to the past, but also to look to the future. And that's what was decided, and Kiki Smith, was brought this design. So it is in some ways, extraordinarily modern, contemporary, and unexpected, but in another way, it is immersed in the decoration of synagogues going back even to ancient times, because it's filled with stars, and then painted around it are stars. And we already had stars painted in some of the vaults at Eldridge Street. And this is a tradition that goes back in Judaism thousands of years, really to the first synagogues, where in different ways the decorators of the synagogue tried to evoke both the heavenly realm, but more generally cosmic time and space. And being under this is one of the reasons that the dome became popular in the 19th century, but being under this canopy of heaven and being associated with the multiplicity, the infinite variety and expansion of heavenly creation, is very important. And when you look at the window at Eldridge Street today, even though it's not on the ceiling, but you look at it, it kind of draws you into that kind of thinking. I have to say, and this is just my private view, I do love the window. I find it personally a little bit overwhelming, because I watched the restoration of that synagogue take place from the 1980s up until around 2010, and it was such a slow and painstaking process, and everything was done so precisely to replicate the original appearance of this. This was the grand Eastern European Orthodox answer to the big uptown German synagogues. This was their response. We can do it too. We can build too. We can be established too. And the window is so amazing that it actually, when you first walk into the building, it sucks your attention right to it, and sometimes you're oblivious to all of the wonderful beauty of this Moorish design and the intricate carving and the painting that has been done around it. If you turn your back to the window and then look at the rest of the building, of course, everything comes into focus. So you do have the past, present, and future all fused together, and that's quite wonderful.
You're reminding me, I lived in Boston at one time early in my career, and occasionally went to a synagogue in Chelsea, which at one time was a very small city in terms of its geographic size, but had a very large Jewish population. And the Jewish community had become less and less. And there was a synagogue that we would occasionally go to that had those ceilings painted with stars, those celestial ceilings. And I've seen it in so many other places. I was in Plovdiv in Bulgaria, again, thousands of miles away, with that celestial ceiling. Sam, just to close.
Actually, Dan, if I may, I'm just so glad that's the Walnut Street Shul, and I'm so glad you mentioned it. I've been working with the congregation there. They're making every effort possible to save that building. I'm actually a member, I send in dues from Syracuse, where I live, to Chelsea, to that synagogue. It's an Orthodox synagogue. I'm not Orthodox, but I support their work. And you're right, the painting is amazing, and they're sort of making the synagogue an ongoing concern, but also kind of trying to create a museum of Chelsea and East Boston Judaism, because all the others, there were once over 20 synagogues in Chelsea. It was, for a while, it was the most densely populated Jewish center in.
I think even referred to as the Jerusalem of Boston. Yeah. It was that kind of community.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that project another time. I'm glad you know about it. It's a wonderful.
I'd be pleased to do it. Just to close, Sam, we've touched upon the rich, complex history of synagogues and discussed some specific examples here in the United States. Big picture, if you can, how would you describe the architectural and historical evolution of synagogues in the New World from the 17th century to today? How could you encapsulate a description of how we've moved over the past several centuries?
Okay, well, if I had a whole semester, I could teach this, but very quickly, Jews are looking for identity, and they're trying to express identity, but they're not trying to be too radical because they want to fit in and be accepted by the majority Christian population. They often they usually, until the late 19th century, employ Christian architects, often architects of churches, and many of their synagogues look like churches, but they have some distinctly Jewish characteristic. It could be tablets of the law on the gable. It could be a menorah on the pediment. It could be a star. And when you went inside, you, of course, had a different arrangement, a different seating arrangement, and you had the ark and the bema. But all of the decoration, you could swap it out, and it could be often a church. And they went through different styles, and they followed the same styles that church builders did as well. Greek and like as in Charleston, and Gothic as in the Norfolk Street Synagogue in New York, and Romanesque, which is ubiquitous, and then Byzantine, like Temple Isaiah, which is in the book in Chicago. Amazing, wonderful book, a wonderful synagogue. So it's really not until the post-World War II period that you get a radical break, and with modernism, and Jews, probably because of they're moving to the suburbs, but it's also the legacy of the Holocaust and really shedding off that past that didn't work for them. And they're saying, we've got to come up with something different and new. And since many leading modernist architects were also Jewish, you could employ a Jewish architect to sort of translate this. And in from the late 1940s through the 1970s, especially, you get a radical transformation of what synagogues are. There are also new demands as Jews move to the synagogue, move to the suburbs. They need community centers because they've left their old Jewish neighborhoods behind. So you need educational wings and social wings. But I think that's when you get some of the most interesting from a kind of design and kind of an intellectual, theoretical level. I still love the old synagogues. I love the old buildings. When I go to a synagogue, like there's a late 1800s synagogue I've been to services at in Troy, New York. I've been to, not too long ago in San Antonio, Texas, to the 1920s synagogue. I love going in these old synagogues and worshiping there. But Jews have always been doing new things too, and they're pushing the boundaries. And I think that's part of the Jewish experience throughout our history, in religion, in all things in society, and in America especially, in all things cultural. We are, if not in the vanguard, we're certainly not in the rear either of cultural change in the society, in the arts, and the architecture and the art of synagogues definitely reflects that.
Well, the book is Synagogues, Marvels of Judaism, published by Rizzoli, with many contributions by Dr. Samuel Gruber, others. It'll be available later this month via Rizzoli. You can go to their website in New York or wherever you purchase books. Sam, thanks for joining me. It's been great speaking with you again, this time about the evolution of synagogues across the Americas.
Thank you, and have a good season and a good Hanukkah. It'll be upon us soon, and I'm going to get a couple copies of this book to give as gifts to people, that's for sure.
Well, it's a good idea. Thanks again to Dr. Samuel Gruber for being with us and talking about synagogues, marvels of Judaism, and delving into such an important aspect of Jewish history. And of course, to all our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Dr. Samuel Gruber, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.